as the sun began to set behind the towering trees. My friends and I arrived at the campsite deep in the heart of the forest. Excitement filled the air as we set up our tents and started a fire for the night. It was supposed to be a fun and a relaxing weekend in nature. But little did we know, it would turn into the scariest experience of our lives. As darkness fell, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories. A chill crept up my spine as I listened to the eeriness of the forest at night. The rustling of leaves and the hooting of owls echoed through the trees, but I shrugged it off, trying to convince myself that it was all just my imagination. As the night went on, the noises became louder and more frequent, causing uneasiness to settle in my gut. My friends eventually retired to their tents, leaving me alone by the dying fire. I sat there for a while, gazing into the darkness, the flickering flames being the only source of light. Suddenly, I heard a loud snap from the surrounding bushes, followed by the heavy footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest as I clutched my flashlight and shining it towards the direction of the noise. At first, I saw nothing but the swaying treetops. But then I caught a glimpse of something, or someone, darting behind a nearby tree. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself that it was just an animal. But as a cold breeze swept through the campsite, I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being watched. I quickly retreated to my tent, zipping it tightly. The darkness inside enclosed me, making it hard for me to fall asleep. Every little noise made me jump, and I couldn't stop the anxious thoughts from flooding from my mind. As I lay there, shivering and wide awake, I couldn't help but wonder if this was a good idea after all. The next morning, my friends and I gathered around the campfire, trying to brush off the events of the previous night as nothing more than an overreactive imagination. We planned to go on a short hike and explore the surrounding area, hoping it would take off our minds of things. As we ventured deeper into the thick forest, we stumbled upon an old cabin. It was old and dilapidated, with broken windows and a creaky front door. My heart started racing at the sight of it, and I felt the chill run down my spine. My friends, however, were excited and pushed open the door, eager to explore. Stepping inside, the musty smell and rotting wood made me feel uneasy. But I tried to hide my fear, not wanting to ruin the fun for my friends. As we searched the cabin, we found some old pictures on the walls, a dusty piano in the corner, and a journal on a table. The journal seemed to be the diary of the previous owner, and as my friends started reading out loud, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread building up inside me. The diary entry spoke of a man who had been living in the forest for years, claiming the trees and animals as his own. But his mental state seemed unstable. He talked about monsters and evil spirits that were after him, and how he was the only one who could protect the forest from them. The more we read, the more frightened and unsettled we became. We quickly leave the cabin, our nerves on edge. As we made our way back to the campsite, a strange noise caught our attention. It sounded like someone was crying. We cautiously followed the sound, which led us to a clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood a tall figure, its back turned towards us. Its long, twisted limbs seemed to blend with the trees, making it hard to distinguish where it ended and the forest began. Its crying sounds seemed to be coming from the figure, but as we approached, the crying turned into a menacing laugh. Fear swept through me as my friends and I stood frozen in place, unsure what to do. As the figure turned towards us, I let out a blood-curdling scream. Its face was deformed and contorted, with piercing red eyes that seemed to stare right through us. Without a second thought, we turned and ran back to the campsite, not even daring to look back. As we reached the safety of our tents, we can still hear the creature's eerie laughter echoing through the forest. We spent the rest of the day huddled inside, too afraid to leave. Our phones had no signal. We were completely cut off from the outside world. That night, as our fire burned low and our nerves were on the edge, we heard heavy footsteps circling our campsite. We were too terrified to even peek outside, knowing that the creature was lurking in the darkness. It felt like hours before the noises finally stopped, and we were able to get some sleep. The next morning, we quickly packed up our things, desperate to leave the forest behind and never look back. As we made our way back to civilization, we couldn't help but reflect on the terrifying events of our camping trip. We may never know for sure what we encountered in that terrifying forest, but one thing was certain. We were lucky to make it out alive. And one thing was for sure. I would never go camping in the forest again. I could feel the sun beating down on me as I hiked deeper into the forest. The warmth was welcome after days of cold and rain, but it also meant that I needed to find a sustainable campsite soon. I had been hiking for hours, with nothing but trees and rocks surrounding me. The tall trees towered over me, casting long shadows on the forest floor. Despite the beauty of nature around me, there was an eerie feeling in the air that made me uneasy. I had always been an avid camper, but this solo trip was testing my limits. I wanted to challenge myself and push myself out of my comfort zone. However, I hadn't anticipated the feeling of being completely and utterly alone in the vastness of the forest. As the sun began to set, my unease turned to fear. I quickly made my way towards it, my heart racing in anticipation of finally having a place to rest for the night. I set up my tent and gathered some firewood before starting a small campfire. The crackling of the fire and the warmth it provided eased my nerves a little. I sat down on a log and took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I watched as the fire danced, and the shadows it created seemed to take on a life of their own. I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the ridiculous thoughts. It was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I cooked myself a simple meal and ate it quickly, eager to crawl into my sleeping bag and get some rest. But as I settled into my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to brush it off as paranoia and exhaustion catching up with me. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. but the rustling of the leaves outside and the hooting of an owl kept me awake. I must have drifted off to sleep at some point because I was jolted awake by a loud cracking sound. My heart was pounding in my chest as I reached for my flashlight and unzipped my tent. I stepped out and shined my light towards the sound. My light fell on a large tree that had split in half. I let out a sigh of relief, reminding myself that this was a natural occurrence. I turned to go back to my tent when I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I quickly shone the light in that direction, but there was nothing there. I felt the back of my hair stand up and ran a chill down my spine. I brushed it off as my imagination once again and went back inside my tent, forcing myself to fall asleep. The next morning, I decided to explore the surrounding area just a little more before counting on my hike. As I walked deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Every time I turned around, there was no one there. But the feeling persisted, making me uneasy and causing my palms to sweat. Suddenly, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The footsteps seemed to gain closer and closer, and I began to pick up my pace. I started to run, my heart racing as I tried to shake off the feeling of being followed. I was so focused on getting away that I didn't see the root sticking out of the ground. My foot caught on it, and I fell to the ground, my ankle twisting painfully. I let out a cry in pain and clutched my ankle, trying to ease the throbbing pain. But as I looked up, I saw a figure standing in front of me. It was a tall and dark figure, its features hidden in the shadows of the trees. My heart was pounding my chest as I scrambled to get away. But the figure didn't move. It stood there, watching me. I couldn't make out any definitive features, but I could feel its eyes boring into me. I stumbled to my feet and leapt away as fast as I could, my heart racing in fear. But as I looked back, the figure was gone. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself. I quickly made my way to the campsite, my ankle throbbing with pain. I packed up my things and decided to cut my trip short. As I hiked back to my car, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being followed. I constantly looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see the dark figure lurking behind a tree. When I finally reached my car, I let out a sigh of relief. I quickly threw my bag in the trunk and got ready to leave. But as I started my car, a figure appeared in my rearview mirror. It was the same figure that had been following me in the forest. Its features were still hidden, but I could feel its cold stare piercing through me. I stepped on the gas and drove away as fast as I could, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But every time I glanced in my rearview mirror, the figure was still there. My heart was racing and my hands were shaking as I finally reached the end of the road. As I drove back home, I couldn't get the image of the figure out of my mind. Who or what was it? Was it just my imagination, or was there truly something lurking in the forest? I shuddered at the thought, and vowed to never go camping alone again. I've always always loved camping. The fresh air, the beautiful scenery, and the scenes of adventure have always drawn me in. So, when my friends and I decided to plan a camping trip in the forest, I was ecstatic. Little did I know, this camping trip would turn into a terrifying experience that would haunt me for years to come. We arrived at the campground at the edge of the forest, our tents and supplies in tow. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the trees. We quickly set up our tents and built a fire, eager to start our adventure in the morning. As we stood around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The forest seemed quiet, too quiet. Not even the sounds of crickets or rustling leaves could be heard. But I pushed this thought aside, thinking I was just being paranoid. It wasn't until we settled into our tents for the night that things started to take a sinister turn. I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a strange noise outside. It sounded like a low growl, but I brushed it off as an animal and closed my eyes. But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder and closer, sending shivers down my spine. I could hear my friends stirring in the tents, also sensing that something was off. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered, my heart racing. My friends confirmed that they heard it too, and we all huddled together in one tent, afraid to go outside and face whatever was making that noise. It wasn't until the sun started to rise that the growling finally stopped. We were grateful to see the light of the day, but we knew we had to investigate the source of the noise. After grabbing our flashlights, we cautiously made our way out of the tent and into the forest. The once beautiful and sincere surroundings now felt ominous and foreboding. Despite our fear, we continued on, determined to find what was lurking in the shadows. We followed the sound of the growling until we came across a cave. It was a small entrance, barely visible through the thick bush. But the growling was coming from inside, with a mixture of curiosity and terror. We cautiously entered the cave. The air was musty and damp, and our flashlights barely pierced through the darkness. As we made our way deeper into the cave, the growling grew louder and more intense. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't feel my palms growing sweaty. Finally, we reached a large chamber, and our flashlights illuminated a pair of glowing eyes staring back at us. We stood frozen, facing a massive wolf-like creature, its fur matted and eyes filled with malice. Its growls echoed throughout the chamber, sending chills down our spines. In a panic, we turned and ran, the creature's snarls and howls ringing in our ears. We ran for what it felt like hours until we finally reached the safety of our campsite. We quickly packed our belongings and left, never looking back. The experience left us unshaken and terrified, and we promised to never speak of it again. But as the years went by, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched whenever I stepped into the forest. Every rustle of leaves or howl of the wind felt like a reminder of that terrifying night. It wasn't until years later, when I decided to go camping again, that I would come to face with that creature once more. This time, I was alone. I had chosen a different campground, far from the forest where my friends and I had encountered the monster. But as I set up my tent, the feeling of unease returned. I pushed it aside, determined to not let my fear control me. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard the familiar low growl. This time, I knew I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my flashlight and bravely made my way towards the source of the sound. My heart was pounding as I entered the forest, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I could hear the growling getting louder, and my steps grew slower with each passing second. Finally, I reached the same cave from years ago. The monster was still there, its glowing eyes staring back at me with a mixture of anger and hunger. I could feel my body freeze in fear, but my curiosity took over. I wanted to know what this creature was and why it had haunted me for so long. With trembling hands, I slowly approached the creature, its growls growing louder and more aggressive. But instead of attacking me, it simply retreated to the back of the cave as it was afraid of me. But as my flashlight illuminated the back of the cave, I saw something that ran my blood cold. There, lying in the corner, was the skeletal remains of a human. It was then I realized that this creature was not a wolf, but a werewolf. In that moment, everything clicked in place. The growls, the sense of being watched, the fear that had followed me for years. It was all because of this creature, this werewolf, who had been terrorizing the forest for who knows how long. I quickly beckoned away from the forest, my mind racing with fear and shock. I ran back to my campsite and packed my things and determined to leave this cursed place and never return. As I drove away, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and sadness. I was relieved to have finally uncovered the truth behind that terrifying camping trip, but sad that it took me so many years to face my fears and find closure. To this day, I haven't told anyone about my encounter with the werewolf. Some say it was all in my head, a figment of my imagination. But I know the truth, and it will haunt me forever. The forest may still hold many mysteries and dangers, but I know that I have faced the scariest one of all. It was a beautiful summer day as we drove into the woods, searching for the perfect spot to set up our tents. The sun was shining through the leaves, creating a warm and inviting atmosphere. We found a clearing near a river and began setting up camp. Everything seemed perfect, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. As night fell, we sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling spooky stories. But the peaceful mood was suddenly shattered when we heard a low growl from the coming bushes. We all froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. As the growling became louder, we quickly grabbed our flashlights and shone them in the direction of the sound. What we saw made our blood run cold. Between the trees, we could make out a pair of red glowing eyes. We could hear something sniffing and rustling in the bushes, and it was getting closer. Without a second thought, we grabbed our belongings and ran back to safety of our tents. We all huddled inside, hearts racing with fear. We could still hear the growling and sniffing outside, but it eventually faded away. We eventually managed to calm down, trying to reassure ourselves that it was just a wild animal. However, that night, I found it difficult to sleep, constantly looking out of the tent window, feeling like something was still out there. The next morning, we woke up to find our campsite in chaos. Our food and supplies had been scattered everywhere, and there were deep claw marks on the trees. It was clear that a bear or something other large predator had paid us a visit. We quickly packed our things and decided to continue our trip deeper in the forest, hoping that to put some distance between us and whatever had frightened us that previous night. We had been hiking for hours when we stumbled upon a cave hidden behind a large boulder. Curiosity getting the better of us, we decided to explore it. As we entered the cave, an overpowering smell hit us. It was a mix of rot and decay. We cautiously continued further into the cave, our flashlights revealing strange symbols and drawings on the walls. It wasn't until we reached the inner chamber of the cave that we found something truly horrifying. There, in the chamber, was a makeshift altar of candles and bones scattered around it. We could see strange symbols etched into the floor, and the walls were covered in what appeared to be dried blood. A chill ran down my spine as I realized we had stumbled upon some sort of ritual. We quickly made our way out of the cave, our minds racing with fear and confusion. Who would perform such a sinister ritual in the middle of the forest? And what were they trying to summon? We had no answers. But one thing was for sure. We needed to get out of there as soon as possible. As we continued our hike, the atmosphere around us seemed to change. The once bright and sunny day had turned into an eerie, foggy afternoon. The birds had stopped chirping, and the rustling of leaves had been replaced by an eerie silence. It felt as if we were being watched, and the feeling only grew stronger as we came across another clearing. This clearing, however, was different from the others. In the center, there was a large tree with hundreds of red ribbons tied around its branches. It looked almost like a shrine, and we could feel an intense energy coming from it. My friends and I exchanged worried glances. We all knew we needed to leave, but we were lost, and the path to our campsite seemed to have disappeared. Just as we were about to give up and spend the night in the strange clearing, we heard the sound of footsteps coming closer. We turned around to see a group of people dressed in black robes, chanting under their breath. They seemed to be performing some sort of ritual, and my heart began to race with fear. We quickly hid behind some bushes and watched in horror as the group pulled a small goat and placed it on the makeshift altar. I tried to look away, but I couldn't tear my eyes off with the gruesome scene before me. They chanted louder and louder until suddenly the goat's body began to convulse, and its eyes turned a sickly shade of crimson. My friends and I let out a collective gasp, and the group of robed figures turned towards us, their faces displaying a mixture of shock and anger. We wasted no time and bolted out of the clearing, frantically running back towards our campsite, hoping to find our way back. As we stumbled through the forest, we could hear the group of robed figures chasing after us, their angry chants and heavy footsteps getting closer and closer. We were running for our lives, fueled by pure adrenaline and fear. Just as we thought we were going to be caught, we saw the familiar clearing where we had to set our camp. We ran faster, our hearts pounding in our chest. We could hear the footsteps and voices in our pursuers getting louder, and we could even see the shadows growing larger. But somehow, We managed to reach our campsite and quickly tore down our tents, threw our things into the car, and drove away without a second thought. We didn't stop until we were miles away from the forest, too afraid to look back. It's been months since that terrifying camping trip, and I still cannot shake off the images of that cave and the strange ritual we witnessed. I had no idea who those people were or what they were trying to do, but I know one thing for sure. I would never go back to that forest again. The memories and the feeling of fear and danger linger with me. A constant reminder of the terrifying camping trip that changed my life forever.